The wind off Bass Strait was pushing sleet sideways down Macquarie Street when my son told me to get out of the car. I remember the exact moment because the wipers were going full pelt and still couldn't keep up, and I was holding the door handle like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He didn't even look at me. He stared straight ahead at the smeared red of brake lights and said, "Dad, just go. Margot's right. We can't keep doing this." 73 years old, a stitched-up hip from the surgery 6 weeks earlier. And my own boy talking about me like I was a stray dog he'd accidentally let into the ute. The name on the dashboard screen was Margot Keller Whitcomb, my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd spent 11 years smiling at me across Christmas tables in Hobart while quietly redrawing the map of my son's life until I wasn't on it anymore. Her voice came through the speaker, tinny and clipped, the way she always sounded when she was performing reasonableness. "Just drop him at the shelter on Liverpool Street, Declan. They'll know what to do with him." We agreed. Like I was a council pickup. Like I was something to be managed. I want to tell you what I should have done. I should have laughed in his face. I should have said, "Son, do you have any idea what you're doing right now? Do you have the faintest clue what's about to happen to you? Because I do. And I've known for 2.5 years, and Margot has too, even if she thinks she's the one running the table." But I didn't say any of that. I sat in the passenger seat of the Pajero my son had bought with money I'd given him as a wedding gift, and I let him drive me through the worst June storm Hobart had seen in a decade, and I kept my mouth shut. Because the thing I was waiting for was already in motion, and the worst thing I could have done was tip my hand. My name is Rory Penhaligon. People who've known me long enough call me Rory. I was born in 1953 inches a weatherboard house in Glenorchy, the son of a wharf foreman and a schoolteacher, and I spent 41 years as a marine surveyor working the southern ports Hobart, Devonport, Burnie, Port Arthur on the bad weeks. I know boats and I know weather, and I know how a small problem becomes a big one when nobody calls it early. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened that night in June was not a surprise to me. I had seen the storm coming for years. I had simply chosen not to mention it. Declan was my only child. His mother, Imogen, died of pancreatic cancer in 2009. He was 21 then, finishing his accounting degree at UTAS. And I think something in him went quiet that year and never quite came back on. He met Margot in 2014 at a corporate retreat at Cradle Mountain. She was a senior associate at a property firm in Sandy Bay. All sharp suits and sharper teeth, and within 6 months she had Declan moved into her flat, and within 18 months they were engaged. And within 2 years, they were married in a function room overlooking Constitution Dock with 80 of her people and 12 of mine. I liked her at first. That's the part nobody believes. But it's true. I liked that she was direct. I'd been a widower for 5 years by then, and I was tired of the careful tiptoeing people did around me, and Margot didn't tiptoe. She told me my house in Sandy Bay was too big for one man, and I should think about downsizing. She told me my fishing boat was a money pit. She told me, 3 months into knowing me, that I needed to update my will. I laughed at the time. I thought, well, at least she says what she means. What I didn't understand, not properly, was that Margot didn't say what she meant. Margot said what she wanted to be true, and then she worked backward from there until everyone around her had agreed. That's a different thing entirely. I only worked it out in the spring of 2023, and by then I was already 2 moves ahead of her, even though she didn't know it. The first warning came at a Sunday lunch at their place in Battery Point. Declan was at the barbecue. Margot was opening a bottle of Pinot, and she said, very casually, like she was commenting on the weather, "You know, Rory, my father transferred his house to my brother and I when he turned 70. It just makes everything cleaner. No probate, no fuss. You should think about it. I remember Declan's back stiffening at the barbecue. He didn't turn around. He just stood there with the tongs in his hand. And I knew in that second they had talked about this. Probably for months. I said, "I'll think about it, love." I didn't think about it. I had already decided, but I needed her to believe I was thinking about it. Because the only way to handle a person like Margot is to let them believe they're winning right up until the moment they're not. 3 weeks later, I drove out to a solicitor's office in Kingston I'd never used before. A woman called Annika Brennan, mid-50s, no nonsense, came recommended to me by an old colleague from the survey days. I sat in her office for 2 hours, and I told her everything. About Imogen, about Declan, about Margot, about the Sandy Bay house, which had been in my family since 1971 and was now worth, on a bad day, $2.25 million. About the share portfolio my wife had built up before she got sick, which I had never touched because I couldn't bear to. About the boat. About a small block of land at Coles Bay I'd bought in 1988 and never told anyone about. About the savings. And I told her about Sayers. This is the part of the story I have never told anyone. I'm telling you now because the secret stopped being a secret 3 months ago, and there's no point holding on to it anymore. In 1991, when Declan was 3 years old and Imogen and I were going through what I can only describe as a complete and quiet breakdown of our marriage, I had a relationship with a woman called Neem Doyle. She was a nurse at the Royal Hobart. She was Irish. She was 31 years old, and she was the kindest person I have ever met in my life. The relationship lasted 4 months. I ended it because I was a coward, and because I loved my wife, and because I had a son. Neem moved back to Galway in the August of that year. I never saw her again. What I didn't know, what she didn't tell me, was that she was 8 weeks pregnant when she got on the plane. I found out in 2003. A letter arrived at the Sandy Bay house, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, postmarked Galway. Imogen brought it in from the mailbox. I opened it at the kitchen table while she was making tea, and I read 3 paragraphs from a woman I had been trying not to think about for 12 years. And at the end of those 3 paragraphs there was a photograph of an 11-year-old girl with my mother's eyes. Her name was Sayers. Neef had named her after her own grandmother. She had grown up not knowing who her father was, only that he was an Australian marine surveyor whose photograph her mother kept in a drawer. Neem wasn't writing for money. She wasn't writing for support. She was writing because she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she wanted her daughter to know who her father was before things got difficult. I told Imogen everything that night. Everything. She cried for about an hour, and then she made another pot of tea. And then she said something I have carried with me for 23 years. She said, "Rory, this isn't about us anymore. This is about that girl. You do whatever you need to do." And then she said, "But not Declan. Not yet. He's 15. He won't understand." So I started writing to Sayers. And I started sending money to Neem, not as support, but as savings for university, for whatever came next. I went to Ireland twice, once in 2005 and once in 2008, and met my daughter, and walked the cliffs at Inishbofin with her, and watched her grow into a woman who looked at the sea the way I look at the sea. Neve died in 2011, 2 years after Imogen. Sayers was 19. I never told Declan. I never told anyone. Not because I was ashamed I was, but that wasn't the reason, but because I had promised Imogen. And because by the time Imogen died, the moment had passed, and because Declan was already drifting and I knew the way you know weather, that telling him would not bring us closer. It would only give him a reason to step further back. And then Margot came along, and the answer became obvious. You don't tell Margot Keller Whitcomb about a half-sister in Ireland with a claim on the estate. Not unless you want to watch her dismantle your daughter's life from 12,000 miles away. So Sayers stayed a secret. She's 33 now. She lives in Cork. She's a marine biologist, of all things, which I think Imogen would have found very funny. She has 2 children, my grandchildren, though Declan doesn't know they exist, and a husband called Brendan who is, by all accounts, a much better man than I was at his age. I told Annika Brennan all of this in her Kingston office in October 2023, and then I told her what I wanted to do. I wanted to put the Sandy Bay house and the share portfolio and the Coles Bay block into a discretionary trust. I wanted Declan to be a beneficiary, but not the only one. I wanted Soursay to be a beneficiary. I wanted my grandchildren, both the ones in Ireland and any future ones from Declan, to be beneficiaries. And I wanted the trustee to be a person Margot couldn't influence, couldn't charm, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't outweight. Annika Brennan smiled at me across her desk and said, "Rory, that's me, isn't it?" We signed the papers in November 2023, and then I waited. Now, here's the part where I have to be honest with you. Because you might be sitting there thinking, well, why did you let it get that bad? Why didn't you say something sooner? The truth is, I wanted to give Declan a chance. I wanted to see if he would, on his own, without prompting, choose to be the man I'd raised. I wanted to see if Margot would, given enough rope, hang herself in front of him so he wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. And she did. Oh, mate, she did. In the spring of 2024, Margot started suggesting I move in with them. The Sandy Bay house was too big. The gardens were too much. The stairs were dangerous after my hip. She had a granny flat at the back of their place in Battery Point that they'd just renovated. It would be lovely. We could be a proper family. Declan kept saying things like, "Dad, you'd have your own space, you'd have your independence, but we'd be right there." I knew exactly what was happening. I'd seen the same pattern in 3 of my old colleagues. The granny flat is the front porch of the nursing home, but I said yes. I said yes because I needed her close. I needed to see what she would do. I sold the Sandy Bay house in February 2025, or rather, the trust sold it. I moved into the granny flat in March. I brought 1 suitcase, my wife's photograph, my fishing tackle, and the small wooden box that contained Source's letters. The rest went into storage. Margot threw a little welcome dinner. She kissed my cheek and said, "We're so glad you're here, Rory." And I smiled and thanked her, and I went to bed in a single room behind my son's house at the age of 73, and I lay there in the dark, thinking about my wife, and about my daughter in Cork, and about the thing that was coming. It took her 4 months. The first sign was the locks. In July, Margot replaced the locks on the main house. I was given a key to the granny flat, but not to the house. "It's just a security thing, Rory," the insurance company asked us to. Then the dinner stopped. Then she started leaving little notes in the granny flat. Reminders. "The bins go out on Tuesday. Please don't use the washing machine after 8 p.m. Please don't leave the back gate open. Please don't smoke on the veranda, even though I haven't smoked since 1994. Then, in May 2026, came the hip operation. I'd been putting it off for 2 years. The surgeon said it had to happen now, or I'd lose mobility for good. I went under at the Hobart Private on the 3rd of May, came out 4 hours later, spent 8 days in hospital and 2 weeks in rehab, and was discharged back to the granny flat on the 24th of May, with a walking frame and a list of physiotherapy appointments. Margot was furious. Not openly. Margot was never openly anything. She was furious in the way she set down a cup of tea on the bench. She was furious in the way she asked Declan, in front of me, whether he'd called the home care agency yet. She was furious in the way she looked at my walking frame like it was something that had been left in her hallway by mistake. The night it happened, the 5th of June, 2026, There was a southerly buster coming up from the Antarctic, and the forecast had been bad all day. Sleet, gale-force winds. Temperatures down to -2 with the wind chill. I was sitting in the granny flat, watching the 7 o'clock news on the ABC when Margot knocked on the door. She had Declan with her. He looked gray. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. She said, "Rory, we need to have a chat." She'd written it down. She had a piece of paper. She read from it, like she was reading a memo at a board meeting. She said the situation wasn't working. She said my recovery was placing an unreasonable burden on the household. She said she had spoken to a social worker, a lie. I checked later. She had not, who recommended a respite care facility on Liverpool Street that could take me that night. She said Declan agreed. I looked at my son, my boy, 38 years old, accountant, married, childless. Because Margot had decided years ago that children would interfere with her career. He wouldn't meet my eye. I said, "Declan, look at me." He didn't. He looked at his shoes. He looked at the carpet. He looked at the wall behind my head. And I understood in that moment that whatever I'd been waiting for him to find inside himself, he wasn't going to find it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. On his own. I said, "Right. I'll get my coat." That's how I ended up in the passenger seat of the Pajero in a sleet storm on Macquarie Street. That's how I ended up watching my son's profile in the green dashboard light while his wife's voice came through the Bluetooth telling him where to dump me. That's how I ended up, at 9:30 on a Friday night in June, standing on the footpath outside a closed council building on Liverpool Street with a walking frame, a small overnight bag, and my coat done up wrong because my hands were shaking too hard to do up the buttons. The shelter wasn't where Margot said it was. Of course it wasn't. The address she'd given Declan was a community center that had closed at 5. There was no respite facility. There was just a locked door and a wet awning and a wind that came up Liverpool Street, like it had a personal grudge against old men. Declan drove away. He drove away. He sat in the car for maybe 40 seconds while I stood on the footpath. And then he put the Pajero into gear and he drove away. And I watched the taillights disappear down toward the waterfront. And I thought, well, there it is. There's my answer. I stood there for a while. I'm not going to pretend I was thinking clearly. I was 73 years old. I was 6 weeks out of hip surgery. I was wet through. And the man who had been my best reason for getting up in the mornings for 38 years had just left me on a footpath. There's no version of that where you stand there feeling anything sensible. After about 10 minutes, I started walking. The walking frame skidded on the wet pavement. I made it about 3 blocks before my hips seized up properly, and I had to sit down on a bench outside a Greek bakery that had closed for the night. The cold was the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays there. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if nobody came past in the next 20 minutes, I was probably in serious trouble. A young woman came past. Her name was Tahlia Brockwell. I learned this later, and she was 26, and she was walking home from a late shift at a restaurant on Salamanca. She saw me, and she didn't hesitate. She crossed the street, sat down on the bench next to me, and asked me if I was all right. And then, without waiting for me to lie about it, she pulled out her phone and called an ambulance. Then she called a Tasmania police non-emergency line. Then she sat with me in the sleet, holding my hand, until both arrived. I want you to remember Tahlia Brockwell. I want you to remember that on the worst night of my life, the person who saved me was a young woman I had never met, who had every reason to keep walking, and who didn't. I have a goddaughter now. In a manner of speaking, we have lunch every second Sunday. The ambulance took me to the Royal Hobart. The police, a sergeant called Manea Tipeni, sat down with me at about 11:30 and asked me, very gently, what had happened. I told him. All of it. The granny flat, the lies about the social worker, the wrong address, my son driving away. He took notes. He asked me if I wanted to make a formal statement. I said yes. Then he said, "Mr. Penhaligon, do you want me to call your son?" And I said, "Yes, but not yet. Wait until about 3 in the morning. And when you call him, don't tell him I'm all right. Just tell him I'm at the Royal and that he needs to come in." The sergeant looked at me for a long moment. Then he gave me a small, tired smile, and he said, "Mate, I shouldn't, but I will. I want to tell you what happened when Declan walked into that hospital room at 3:15 in the morning. Because it's the part I'd been waiting 2.5 years for. I was propped up in the bed. I had a drip in my arm. Because I was mildly hypothermic, my hip was stable. The nurse had been kind. Annika Brennan was sitting in the chair beside the bed. Because I had called her at midnight and she had driven in from Kingston in the rain. Because that's the kind of solicitor she is. She had a manila folder on her lap. Declan came through the door fast. He stopped about 2 paces in. He saw me. He saw Annika. He saw the folder. And he went the color of wet ash. He said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought Margot said. I let him talk. I let him stand there and stutter through whatever version of it he'd cobbled together on the drive from Battery Point. I let him say all of it. And when he ran out of words, I said, "Sit down, son." He sat. I said, "Declan, in about an hour, the police are going to want to talk to you. Not to charge you with anything. Not yet. Just to take a statement. You're going to tell them the truth. All of it. Including the part where Margot told you what to do and you did it." He started to cry. I'd seen him cry twice in his adult life. Once at his mother's funeral, and once when his dog died in 2018. This was the 3rd time. I said, "Now, listen to me carefully, because this is the only time I'm going to say it. 2.5 years ago, I sold the Sandy Bay house. I didn't sell it to you. I sold it to a discretionary trust. Annika, here is the trustee. The proceeds from the sale, the share portfolio your mother left, the block at Coles Bay, all of it sits in that trust. You're a beneficiary. But you're not the only one. And you're not the controlling one. The trustee makes the decisions, and the trustee answers to a deed, and the deed is very specific about what kind of conduct disqualifies a beneficiary from receiving distributions." He stared at me. I said, "Margot's name is not on any of it. Margot has no claim on any of it. Margot has never had a claim on any of it. Whatever she has been telling you for the last 11 years about what was coming to you, coming to her, really, let's be honest, was based on a set of assumptions she never bothered to verify." He whispered, "Dad," I said, "there's one more thing. You have a sister. Her name is Saoirse. She's 33. She lives in Cork with her husband and her 2 children. I've known about her since 2003. Your mother knew. We made a decision together, and the decision was mine to keep. And I'm telling you now because the time for keeping it is over. She's a beneficiary of the trust as well. She has been for 2.5 years. You're going to meet her, Declan. Probably this Christmas. I'd like that very much." He put his face in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. The drip clicked. Annika sat very still in her chair. Outside, the sleet was finally easing. He said into his hands, "I don't know who I am." And I said, "And this is the part that matters. This is the part I want anyone watching this to take away." I said, "Son, you're a man who made a terrible choice tonight. That's all you are at this exact moment. What you become from here is up to you, not me. Not Margot. You. The marriage didn't survive. Of course it didn't. Margot was served with notice by Annika. 2 days later, she was not technically doing anything to her, just informing her of certain facts about the trust and certain facts about the property she'd been living in, which, it turned out, had been refinanced 3 years earlier in a way she hadn't paid close enough attention to. Declan filed for divorce in August. The settlement was complicated, but Margot walked away with substantially less than she'd assumed she would, and Declan walked away with substantially less than I'd assumed he would. And I think both of those things were the correct outcomes. Declan moved into a one-bedroom flat in West Hobart in September. He started seeing a counselor. He came to dinner at my new place, a small unit in Sandy Bay, 2 streets from where the old house used to be every Sunday. We didn't talk about Margot for months. We talked about his mother. We talked about the fishing trips we used to take to the Tasman Peninsula when he was a boy. We talked about Sire very carefully, very slowly, because he was processing a lot. He flew to Cork in November of last year. I went with him. I watched my son meet his sister at Cork Airport, and I watched her hug him, and I watched her 8-year-old son shake his hand very seriously like a small old man, and I thought, well, all right, some of this is recoverable. Not all, but some. I'm 73 years old. I will not see my grandson grow up to be a man. I will probably not see my granddaughter graduate from university. I have made peace with this. What I have not made peace with, what I do not think any father ever makes peace with, is the years I lost with my son because I was too proud, or too cautious, or too clever for my own good, and chose to let him find the right answer on his own when I should have sat him down and made him hear it. So let me tell you what I would tell anyone watching this, anyone over 60, anyone whose children have started talking about granny flats, anyone whose daughter-in-law has started suggesting you simplify your affairs. Don't sign the house over. Not while you're alive. Not while you can still draw breath and make decisions. There are structures, trusts, life estates, binding financial agreements that can do everything a transfer can do without putting you at the mercy of the people you love most. Talk to a solicitor you found on your own. Not one your children recommended. Pay them properly. Tell them everything. Don't move into the granny flat unless you have somewhere else you can go. Independence isn't selfish. Independence is the last gift you can give your children, because it means they get to love you without being responsible for you. Don't keep secrets that can be used against you. But don't tell them to people who will weaponize them either. There's a middle path, and it usually runs through the office of someone who charges by the hour. And if you have a child you've been protecting from a truth about a sibling, about an estate, about anything, ask yourself honestly whether you're protecting them or protecting yourself. The answer matters. It mattered for me. By the time I worked it out, my son was 38 years old and standing in a hospital room at 3 in the morning learning, all at once, that he had a sister, and that his wife had been wrong about everything, and that his father had been 3 moves ahead of him for years. That's too much to learn, in one night. I should have given him pieces of it earlier. That's on me. I own that. The last thing I want to say is this. The young woman who sat with me on that bench, Tahlia, asked me a few weeks ago what I would do differently if I could go back. She thought I'd say I'd never have moved into the granny flat, or I'd have told Declan about Sire sooner, or I'd have refused to get in the car that night. I told her no. I would do almost all of it the same, because the trust held, because my daughter is in my life, because my son, finally, at the age of 39, knows who he is and who he isn't. And he wouldn't know either of those things if Margot hadn't been allowed to show him, in front of him, what she was actually capable of. The only thing I would do differently, I told her, is I would have done up my coat properly before I got out of the car. The buttons, that's the only regret. A man should always do up his own buttons. Take care of your parents. And if you're a parent, take care of yourself, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And the people who say they will are usually the ones you most need to watch. That's all I've got. Mind how you go.